The Bible teaches us that there's some errors that are just lame, and the other errors are gangrenous. And Paul tells Timothy to watch out for this error. It's going to spread like gangrene, and this is one of those errors.
Okay.
As I believe the conditions are ripe, and the cultural moment is inflamed, such that if this particular error catches fire, then people are it's going to be a much, much bigger mess than it is currently.
Welcome to Indie Thinker with Reed Huberman. You're about to make the jump from the dishonest mainstream media into free and independent thought from key thought leaders on the subjects of culture, causes, politics, and faith.
Pastor Doug, thanks so much for being here.
Good to be with you.
All right, so I'm going to get on a rabbit trail for just a moment and get off the subject of what we're actually going to talk about. But for just a moment, I want to ask you a question about Christopher Hitchens. I started to notice your ministry much after kind of COVID, and so I had to go back down the past to kind of see things that you had done, and finally got introduced to Collision and your conversation with Christopher Hitchens, and all of that's just absolutely fantastic. And so there may even still be some people who don't know that that's somewhere lingering down there in the past that are familiar with the work that you've done. But on Collision, there's this really cool moment where you and Christopher Hitchens are speaking in the back of a vehicle. And there, Christopher Hitchens says that even if he could get rid of Christianity, he wouldn't do it. I thought that was extraordinary. And one, and then two, I also thought that it was something that was very soul-bearing for him to say to you in that moment, and something that I don't think I can ever say that he said to anybody else. So I'm wondering, obviously we don't have the luxury of speaking to him anymore about this, but I'm wondering if you could crawl inside of his head and maybe suggest why you think it is, because he said in that moment that he doesn't really have an explanation for why, if he could get rid of Christianity, he wouldn't do it. But I'm wondering if you have a suspicion as to why that is.
I do. The way he put it was, if there was one last Christian left and we could convert him, he said, I wouldn't do it. And he's recounting a conversation he had with Richard Dawkins. And Dawkins said, what do you mean you wouldn't do it? I wouldn't do it. I don't know why, but I wouldn't do it. He wouldn't cross that final threshold. And there's two things that I would suggest were involved. One, I think there was a little bit of scotch involved.
That'd do it.
But I don't think the scotch made him say things he didn't believe. I think it was one of those things where it just simply loosened him up, and he said this. And so the question is, why would he say something like that? And I would put it in the same category as what Richard Dawkins himself recently did when Dawkins identified himself as a cultural Christian. I think that Hitchens saw early on some of the problems with Islam and that sort of thing. And God Is Not Great, his book attacking religion, he attacks Christianity, but he's particularly virulent with regard to Islam. And I think that Hitchens, like Dawkins, has a certain level of affection for the fruit of Christianity. Now, coming from Dawkins, it was as though when he said, "I love Christmas carols and I love cathedrals and I don't like mosques and I don't like that and I like this." He was in effect saying, "I love apple pie and I hate orchards." Right. And I think that Christopher Hitchens was in a similar place.
Yeah, but there seems to be a little bit of progress there in terms of, I don't think that Richard Dawkins would have said what he said with that cultural Christian comment maybe even 5 years ago. I think that what's happening in England has brought him to the conclusion that Christianity is way more pervasive. He's swimming in Christian waters more than he knows. And as those waters become less Christian, he's starting to reap the consequences, I think, of his action.
I think that's fair.
Maybe one last question about that. And this is a bit of an insinuation, so forgive me for doing so. So I'll get a little psychological. Whenever I hear you talk about Christopher Hitchens, there seems to be an affection there. Where does that affection come from? And maybe if I'm right about that assumption.
Right. Yeah, you're right. We hit it off. We hit it off, and we had He was never rude to me except on stage.
The shtick.
That was part of his shtick. We had breakfast together, and we visited over meals. And there's a section in the movie where we're trading Woodhouse quotes, P.G. Woodhouse quotes. So, in terms of personality, in terms of common interests, and there were certain cultural things that we had in common, and that was a sort of a common grace level friendship. Obviously, you couldn't call it fellowship, but and the same thing with his brother Peter Hitchens. In fact, I met Peter before I met Christopher. Yeah, and it was the same sort of thing. We hit it off there too. Although Peter is a Christian, and so it's hard to tell. I can easily imagine some atheists who would be so militant and bitter that I wouldn't get along with them at all. But one of Hitchens' great strengths was his sense of humor and his wit. His arguments were just as lame as other arguments.
Yes. That's not going to sit well online with atheists, but it is true.
But when you're debating with him on stage, you have to keep your eye on him every second, because you could present a devastating argument and he'd crack a joke and deflect it.
Yeah.
So he was a master rhetorician.
You're not half bad yourself. When you were talking about, I think it was the slaughter of the Amalekites, and you said, just wait till I get you to say something next. I think that probably has something to do with it too. So. Well, I wanted to talk with you today predominantly about things that are going on in the church and what you wrote about in the Antioch Declaration. So you've done podcasts in the past about the Antioch Declaration, going through it even item by item and talking about it in depth. But I kind of want to pull back and get a little bit more philosophical and talk about it just in terms of what issue you're trying to address with the Antioch Declaration. Right. What are you seeing? And the reason for that comes from the fact that I have a bit of skepticism as to whether or not the things that you seem to address in the Declaration are very widespread or even that pervasive. And then it got me questioning, well, okay, so if it's not that big of a deal, why address it? So we'll get to that kind of second question in a moment. But what is the issue that the Antioch Declaration is predominantly trying to address?
What we're trying to address primarily is and I'm going to qualify this in a little bit, but basically identity politics on the right.
Okay.
That's and it might be whites and blacks. It might be Jews and Gentiles. It might, there could be different manifestations of it. But that would be the heart of it, trying to address or head off the development of identity politics on the right. Now, you touched on something there that's important. The Bible teaches us that there's some errors that are just lame, and the other errors are gangrenous. And Paul tells Timothy to watch out for this error. It's going to spread like gangrene, and this is one of those errors.
Okay.
As I believe the conditions are ripe, and the cultural moment is inflamed, such that if this particular error catches fire, then people are it's going to be a much, much bigger mess than it is currently. Now, I think that it's a significant issue currently, but right now I think it's primarily an online phenomenon.
Okay.
Right. The people who are fomenting anti-Semitism or kinism, the people who are urging those sorts of things are, by and large, extremely online. They're just very much online. So if I tweet something about the Jews or say something about Israel or whatever, it's pretty much guaranteed to be swarmed, right? And I think the technique or the tactic is to flex in such a way as it looks like your numbers are way bigger than they are.
Right.
At the same time, the nature of the problem, I think, is gangrenous, and especially in this moment. So consequently, even though I don't think it's all that big in the population at large.
So numerically, it's not that big.
Numerically, it's not that big. If you gathered up all the conservative, reformed, evangelical Christians at a giant conference, and the Kinists or the anti-Semites did a breakout workshop, informal, because the sponsors of the conference wouldn't put up with it. But let's have lunch together. I don't think they would have a ton of people.
Yeah.
Right. But I also believe that our cultural moment is such that, and is so inflamed, that the conditions are ripe for them to be recruiting, right? And that's why I think it's a potentially gangrenous problem.
So I want to ask a question about leadership then, because I think one of the things that would allow for a movement to become more gangrenous is if we believe that there are people who are kind of figureheads for this movement. So if to unfortunately quote the bad guys in the Bible, if you strike down the leader, then the disciples will scatter. So there is something to the idea, though, that if that serpent has a head, it's a little bit more dangerous. So, especially with the naming of the Antioch Declaration, I can't help but ask you a question, because I'm assuming, and you tell me if my assumption is right, that has to do with the Antioch incident between Peter and Paul.
Yeah.
And so for those who don't know, essentially, Paul has to reprove Peter because he's gotten in with a group of people who are trying to influence the way he thinks about a soteriological issue. So all that said, is there a Peter in mind in terms of the Antioch Declaration that you were aiming this at?
There was a number of people involved in the Antioch Declaration, so I'm just speaking for myself here. But the entity that I have in mind is a website called Stone Choir, and Corey Mahler is one of the lead figures there. He's an excommunicated Lutheran, and a lot of the energy and noise and stuff is coming from that.
Okay.
From that quadrant. So, but it's a more complicated problem than that, because you've got Stone Choir and another couple. Another name I'm willing to name besides Corey Mahler would be Samuel Holden. Samuel Holden has put out a couple of videos, a White Boy Summer video and a White Boy Christmas video. And the White Boy Summer video it was like 3 or 4 minutes, I forget how long it was, but it's a short little video with music, and it shows a bunch of white guys doing wholesome stuff and Americana stuff. But it also has a bunch of Nazi figures, a distant photo of Hitler, the torch. It concludes with the torch at the 1936 Berlin Games. Has the founder of the American Nazi Party. So he's liberally sprinkled a bunch of Nazi stuff in this video. So the people I'm specifically willing to say that's bad juju that you're peddling be Corey Mahler, Stone Choir, and Samuel Holden. That'd be the agitators. That said, there are other people on the right who I would argue ought to know better, right? Who retweet, the White Boy Summer video goes out, drops, and people retweeting it who I don't believe hold to what Holden is saying, but they're leaving their doors and windows unlocked in a bad neighborhood. So I'd say I'm opposing these guys because they are Nazis. Let's fight the Nazis. I'm opposing the Jew haters, and I'm also admonishing the negligent pastors. Right. So the negligent pastors I want to continue to work with and say, hey, I'm happy to be at a party with you. If I get invited to a party, I'm not going to stay away just because you came. I'm happy to be at a party with you. But it's the guy you keep bringing with you that I don't want to be with.
Right.
And if you're retweeting these guys, you need to look way more closely at what you're doing. But that's pastoral negligence as opposed to kinism, or and it might be there might be kinism under the surface or anti-Semitism. But if you talk to the pastors, they would say, "Oh no, I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not anti-Semitic, or I'm not a kinist."
Well, you talked about the gangrenous effects of kind of this anti-Semitic movement, identity politics on the right, and I'll be honest, I'm less concerned. This is just personal, but I'm less concerned with some of the names that you named in terms of their actual influence. And I don't know if it's just my mind going to the least common denominator here, but I'm actually more concerned with the pastors who are engaging in some of the wisdom kind of pastoral issues, because I think that they actually do have the influence to kind of stoke these fires.
That's how this thing spreads. So, for example, let's say Stone Choir's putting out garbage, and a pastor has a church with 2 members that follow Stone Choir, and they start, sharing their stuff, and it doesn't represent the church at all. I think pastoral negligence that doesn't actually deal with that the people who are playing footsie with it.
Yes.
That's what enables it to spread. So the thing that will cause the bad stuff to spread would be otherwise respectable people giving it the time of day.
Well, let me step back actually and ask a question of taxonomy. Do you believe, and forgive me because I know that this is loaded. Anytime you put a title on something, people are going to nitpick it to death. But I also think titles are particularly helpful. Would you call this movement woke right?
Yeah, not without qualification.
Okay.
But yes, with qualification.
Okay.
Yes, I need an extra adjective here.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think what's going on. I said earlier that the Antioch Declaration was aimed at identity politics on the right, but a lot depends on where the impetus for this identity politics is coming from. So I would, instead of saying woke right, which is sort of a term of abuse that some people that I would consider mildly woke left, oh, you're woke right. It's just, you're just name calling.
Yeah.
Because what a diehard, red-pilled conservative, what's going to annoy him the most? Well, getting labeled woke anything. That's going to annoy him. So if it's going to annoy him, let's call him that.
Right.
Right. But I think that there's an argument there, but it's a different argument than what's going on with the woke left. With the woke left, which came out of the Frankfurt School, critical theory, all of that intellectual history,
Marxism,
that landed in the Me Too movement and the BLM moment and everything. That wokeness has a pedigree, and the people who are promoting the woke thing are doing it on purpose. Okay, if it's a tennis game, they're serving. Okay, this is what we're about. This is what we're advancing. This is what we're doing. On the right, I think it's a different problem entirely. So I would call the right, the manifestation of this on the right, I would call the reactionary woke right. Okay, I think that's what it is. It's reactionary. So think of it this way: if you're an out of work steel worker or out of work blue collar worker, and you're 35 years old, you've got a family to feed, and your entire adult life you have seen whites disparaged, attacked, called the cancer of our whiteness is the problem. Whiteness is the problem. So all the DEI stuff that's currently being expunged from the federal government has been going on for a generation or more with different terminology. So what's happened is, biblically speaking, there is no such thing as the category of white. The Bible never groups us according to skin color. Right? It just doesn't. Now, there is such a thing biblically as the Navajo and the Swedes and the Haitians.
So ethnicity, not race.
Ethnicity, not race. Tribes, not race. Okay? So if I grow up next door to a black man who's and I've been friends with him our entire lives, and his people have lived here in America for 350 years, and mine have. I have far more in common with him than I do with a Romanian who's the same skin color that I am. Yeah. A Romanian who's never been to America, doesn't know anything about baseball. All of the things. So culture, the issue is culture, and culture is generally expressed ethnically, right? If you just leave everybody alone and there's no ideology, then people tend to, birds of a feather flock together. White people tend to marry white people, and black people tend to marry black people, and so those traits are reinforced. But the driving engine of all of that is culture. Okay? Now, and the exception would be when you have a different kind of culture, like in a cosmopolitan place like New York City, where you've got an active churn going on. But generally speaking, people don't go up to North Minnesota to get people to diversify, and they don't go to Nigeria to get them to diversify. Generally speaking, you leave people alone. It's fine to be white. It's fine to be black. It's fine to be Japanese, right? But that's the identity. For someone to come in and categorize, white solidarity,
right?
I'd say, where did that come from? It's as foolish as me organizing my library by putting all the blue books on the east wall and all the red books on the opposite wall. I don't categorize books that way. But where's it coming from? Well, it's coming from the category of white as the villain was established by the woke left.
Right.
They established that as a category. They made it a thing.
Right.
Okay, which had largely been dealt with. It was a thing previously in other eras because of Darwinism and other issues, but in the latter part of the 20th century, first part of the 21st century, the thing that made whiteness a tag that people felt comfortable applying to themselves was the villainization of whites by the left. And so a lot of white people who are unemployed, out of work, can't get accepted to a college. They got diverse. They applied for a job, and a less qualified candidate got it because of their last name and stuff. And then plus all the vilification that's being aimed at them, a whole bunch of people decided, if they're going to hang me for a thief, why don't I steal something? Right? If they're going to call me a racist, no matter what I do, I think I'm going to be all right. Okay, fine. I'm white and proud, right? And so that's why I call it a reactionary move. And I think it's strategically dumb, because what you're doing is you're letting the left define you. And I don't want I've argued for years that all of our cultural battles are battles over editorial control of the dictionary. Okay, I don't want the left defining what a girl is. I don't want the left defining what a boy is. I don't want the left defining what a white man is.
Right.
They're not in charge of that.
We'll get back to the show in just a moment, but today's show is sponsored by our friends over at Sweet and Savory Classroom. This online and in-person cooking experience is a great date night idea. So fellas, if you want to make your wife happy, if you want to have a great meal and have a great fun, entertaining night and combine those two things while saving a little bit of money, then you need to check out sweetandsavoryclassroom.com, where you can check out all the great opportunities and classes that they have coming up. And even if you're not in the Sweet and Savory area, you can book online classes that will be great educational experiences for the whole family. So go to sweetandsavoryclassroom.com to see all the things they have to offer. And when you check out, use the promo code IndieThinker for a discount on your next order.
So this is why I have a question about this, because this goes back to the pastoral wisdom issue. When a pastor posts something, and this is a maturity issue too, when they post it within the context of joking, and they post something about White Boy Summer, it makes me come away scratching my head, and this is the way I've seen this manifest. I'm largely skeptical about the gangrenous nature of what we're talking about, but I'm not skeptical about the existence of anti-Semitism and revisionist history and all that stuff. As an armchair historian, I see it all the time with the Crusades and all sorts of other things. I don't understand how a pastor can post anything like that, even in jest, without understanding the undertones or the overtones, or let's just call it subtext, the subtext behind all of this. So this is the thing that really does kind of capture my attention, because what I think I see is high-profile, influential Christian leaders who are playing the "why are you hitting yourself" game. And by that, what I mean is, I said this about Matt Chandler, and I think it's fair to say about them. When Matt Chandler gets up and says, well, you don't need to interpret this passage through a white Eurocentric lens, and I'm just thinking, nobody is doing that. What are you talking about? And then when we respond to that, then he says, oh, why are you getting so mad about this? The same game, I think, is played by other pastors online who are posting things that have either racial overtones or anti-Semitic subtext, and then saying, well, that's not exactly what I meant. You're taking that out of context, but then not trying to give the devil his due in terms of what they're actually after. So I don't know if you've seen that, but that's the thing that kind of is really, I think, the problem here, that I think we do have to assess the motive behind why they would act so ignorant when we know they're not.
Okay, so I think they're thinking you might factor in other issues like any clicks are good clicks,
Okay. So that was my thought. I thought it seems to be clickbait to me.
Okay. Well, there. I think that element is there. Anything that drives traffic to the site or name recognition, that's all. That is all part of it. But when take this moment versus 10 years ago. Okay. Some of the things you see pastors posting or tweeting that seem really provocative or insensitive or whatever. If that thing had been tweeted by a minister in that position 10 years ago, his ministry would be over. It would be all done, because the left had the power to police, and they policed in accordance with their dictates. So even people who thought transgressive thoughts wouldn't say things like that out loud, because you could get fired, you could be frog marched to the door, your ministry could be done, and so forth. These guys are banking on, okay, I just said this naughty thing, I just said this transgressive thing, and I'm betting that when the outrage ensues, I'll be able to say, I really don't care, Margaret.
Yeah.
Okay, and to a certain extent, they're right. Right. There are a lot more people who are less willing to be outraged at transgressive statements. Okay? Now, I'm completely with them when it comes to the politically correct language that the left tried to enforce.
Yeah.
I like it when we're transgressive that way. But what is happening is people are thinking one's good, two's better, and that's not always the case. There's if someone put together a white boy summer video, and my reaction, I didn't like it from the very beginning, because I knew how easily this kind of thing goes off the rails. If you've got teenage boys who wrestle in the living room from time to time, it's their job to wrestle, and it's mom's job to stand in the doorway saying, someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to get hurt. And that's what this was for me. If you do a little video of white boys, somebody caused a storm on a campus a number of years ago by putting up placards that said, it's okay to be white.
Yeah.
Right. That is the right kind of transgressive, because you're pushing against.
I like that.
You're pushing against the left narrative. It is okay to be white. Why? But if you say something like whites are supreme, right? There's another fellow I mentioned, Michael Spangler, who tweeted, Jews are evil, whites are supreme.
Yeah.
Okay. And I say, okay, this white boy summer game, if you were showing videos video of blonde surfer boys and rock climbers and a football player and stuff, and a white boy summer, and you limited yourself to that, might not be the smartest thing in the world, but it's sort of in there with it's okay to be white. It could be construed that way.
Right.
But it went off the rails in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Right? It just went, and it became really toxic and nasty and hate-filled, and the people who and another doctrine came in, which is the netter principle, which is no enemies to the right. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm not going to let the left steer me by demanding that I apologize for this nutcase over here to my right. Oh, I'm not going to apologize for him because I didn't do that, and I'm not going to dance when you call the tune. Mm-hmm. Well, there really is a good impulse there. I don't want to have any enemies to my right because the left demands it. Mm-hmm. Right? I don't want to obey them. I don't want them to control the dictionary. I don't want to respond to them. But it's a very simple question. Does God have enemies, any enemies to my right? Mm-hmm. And if God has any enemies to my right, then I ought to.
Right.
And if I'm a shepherd, if I'm a pastor, and I say something like, no enemies to my right, then I'm just telling the devil where his next attack should come from. Mm-hmm. Right? If he says, "Oh, thanks, Wilson," I'm gonna mount an offensive against your flock, against your congregation, and we're gonna come from the right, and you're gonna be in no position to deal with it because you've declared that you don't have any city walls to the right.
My concern with that too is that what is potentially a pretense for strategy is actually just a motive of personal gain. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, so anybody that's familiar with this kind of controversy, we'll call it, will potentially know what I'm talking about here. But I think you responded to this directly, but there was an individual who posted a meme or something on social media who is a pastor, and it was from a movie where, and this sounds as stupid as it actually is probably, where Santa is the son of Satan or something like that, and then in the movie kills a Jewish man with a candelabra.
Yeah.
Okay, so he didn't actually post that, but he posted something from that movie, which seems to be a little bit of a dog whistle.
So yeah, it was really, really, really bad. So that was the video, The White Boy Christmas, that Samuel Holden did.
Okay.
And so what he did was, there was a scene where this surly-looking Santa. The movie was called Santa Slays, Slays.
Real high-level stuff, yeah.
High-level Christmas horror movie. And this surly-looking Santa is walking down the street, eating a bagel or eating something, and he bumps into a black hat Jew. There's a group of, it looks like 3, but it's actually 4 black hat Jews, and they bump into each other, and there's a bad blood glances exchanged, and then it goes on. That was embedded in this White Boy Christmas video. Mm-hmm. But in the movie, that scene immediately follows the scene where that Santa murdered a Jewish baker with a menorah, with a religious symbol of the Jewish faith, and pinned him to the wall with a menorah, and then took the roll or whatever it was he was eating, walking down the street. And so that is simply inflammatory and wicked. There's no excuse for it, and it's just wicked. And pastors who overlook that, or who can't see that, or don't want to acknowledge it because they don't want to be accused of
violence. Or even retweeted it.
Retweeting it.
Yeah.
Right. That was basically, that is pastoral misconduct. It's just
so I think it even goes beyond that. So my accusation, and again, I make this with full-throated, but also with care, is that I can't help but wonder if what they say is a strategy of no enemies to the right, or that we're okay to antagonize them because they antagonized us. They're saying, oh, this is strategy against the left, is actually a pretense for personal gain, because what actually happens as a result of that is there is a quorum of people online who they gain attention from by doing stuff like that. And with clicks in our present world comes dollars.
Right.
And so I think it also goes beyond a lack of pastoral wisdom, but it also goes to a sanctification issue of, are you merely tolerating this or even virtue signaling to this because you have something personally to gain from it?
Right. So there's something to what you say, and I would only qualify it this way. The lack of pastoral wisdom, I think, is objective. I can be objectively shown. That people will draw the wrong conclusion from you retweet this. People are going to think you're something that you say you're not. It's just dumb. You should that, and that's the best I can say for it, is that it's dumb. To say that you are, I don't have access to that person's motives, right? So it's not objective the way the other parts of this are.
Certainly.
So if the pastor who retweets it might really be anti-Semitic, might really be a kinist, and he's pretending not to be, right? That could be, he could be as evil as the guy who made the clip, or he could be just wanting traffic. He just wants to be famous, or he is dumb, really is that foolish, really is that dumb. It could be any number of things. Any number of attitudes or dispositions are consistent with what would bring about someone to do something like that. So the thing that was done is objectively wrong and sinful, but the motives for doing it might vary. And I don't have access to those motives.
Sure. Fair enough. I can't help but want to assert those motives just simply because I feel like I understand the nature of the game, that there are a couple ways that you can get really popular online really quick. You can engage in conspiracy theories. Billy Carson, for crying out loud, and what just happened with Wesley Huff is a perfect example that you can be a total charlatan and not know anything that you're talking about, but get really popular really quick, go on the biggest podcast platforms out there, and do so by engaging in kind of wild-eyed conspiracy theories about UFOs and that kind of thing. But then I think another thing is to say the unsayable thing, which is something that of course, you do you if you're not a Christian. Right. But if you are, well, then our language is not our own.
Right.
And that's where I think we transgress.
Right. Yeah, there's no disputing that it's a transgression. It's just what kind of transgression is it? Yeah. Right? There are people, you can pick any number of sins, drunkenness or fornication or gambling. Those sorts of things can have really sinful expressions, but the things that drive individuals to go there vary. So what it boils down to is the pastors who are engaging in that level of negligence shouldn't be accommodated. They're not pastoring wisely. They should be called out on it. Look, this is not healthy and right. But I don't know that you're doing it because you want to be a millionaire. I don't know either. Although the clickbait lust is a temptation for this generation. Yeah. And it should be one of your thesis should be one of the live options for when this all comes crashing down, and it will come crashing down. The post-game analysis, I think, might well reveal that you're exactly right. Yeah,
I probably am, because I typically am. You can ask my wife. So I want to ask an antagonistic question, because I know what some people will say in response to this, that there's a double standard for the Doug Wilsons of the world. Boomer conservatism has a soft spot for the Jews. We don't talk about Muslims that way, and there's essentially a double standard here. So how would you respond to people who would say that?
Yeah. So a number of things. I've got a book coming out in the next month or so, small book called "Boast Not Against the Branches," which is a reference to Romans 11, where Paul talks about the unbelieving Jews who were cut out of the olive tree. Caiaphas was cut out of the olive tree, and believing Gentiles were grafted into the olive tree. I'm a Reformed Christian, and from the Reformation down to the present, the Reformed tradition has been the most friendly toward the Jews out of all the wings of Christendom. The Reformed Netherlands was a haven for the Jews. Oliver Cromwell, the Jews had been banished from England in the 1200s. Oliver Cromwell opened up and had the Jews come back. Reformed Christians have had a long, long history, centuries-long history, not of saying that the Jews are another people of God. There are some theologies that want to say that there's two ways to heaven, being a Jew and being a Christian. The Reformed have never argued that or maintained that. But in the Reformation, one of the rallying cries was ad fontes, back to the sources, which was also a Renaissance thing. And many of the reformers went back to the rabbis in order to learn Hebrew, the language of the Old Testament. And that Hebraicism of the Reformed tradition has colored everything. So some people argue, and I think this is just wrong-headed, that North American evangelicals have a warm spot in their heart for Israel because of dispensational theology. Okay, and dispensationalism holds that the Jews will return to the land, which they did in 1948, and there's certain distinctives of dispensationalism, and evangelicalism in North America is overwhelmingly dispensational.
Yep.
Right. So if you rounded up 10,000 evangelicals at random and asked them about Israel, there'd be a lot of warmth toward Israel, a lot of positive vibes toward Israel, and a lot of it would be dispensational.
Right.
Okay. In motivation, the Reformed motivation is distinct and has nothing to do with the Holocaust or World War II or the founding of Israel. It has nothing to do with that. So in this book...
and not even eschatologically dispensational, right?
Right. It's not dispensational at all. And it antedates the rise of dispensationalism by centuries. So what this book largely consists of is quotes from Reformed leaders, theologians, pastors, preachers, from Spurgeon to Bootser to just I just assemble all these quotes saying there's a great book by Ian Murray called The Puritan Hope, and the Puritan Hope argues that the conversion of the Jews promised in Romans 11 is a future event, and so basically the Reformed tradition, the mainstream Reformed tradition, has been that at a future date in God's prophetic calendar, the Jews are going to return to Christ, and they're going to be grafted back into the olive tree. And when that happens, there will be a Paul says, what will it be but life from the dead? Okay, now there is a very recent theology that has also developed within Reformed circles called preterism. Preter is from the Latin word for past. So the preterists on this issue say that the conversion of the Jews happened in the first century already, and that there is no prophetic future for the Jews at all. And that position is what I would call hard supersessionism. So supersessionism is the view that the church is Israel now. Okay. In dispensationalism, the church and the Jews are two distinct entities. Supersessionism says that the church is the heir of all God's promises in the Old Testament. The church is Israel now. But then I divide supersessionism into two categories. Hard supersessionism that says the church replaces Israel, and there's nothing more for the Jews at all. They can come to Christ like anybody else, like the Navajo and like the.
Do you believe that's widespread in the Reform movement?
No, I think hard supersessionism is a recent development within the last generation or so.
Okay.
Overwhelmingly, the Reformed mainstream is what I would call soft supersessionism.
Okay.
Where the church is Israel now, but the Jews, the olive branches that were cut out of the olive tree are still stacked by the orchard, and God has a plan for them. Someone says, hey, let's throw them on the burn pile, and God says, no, I've got a plan. They're going to be grafted back in. And when they're grafted back in, just wait. It'll be totally great.
Yeah. I can't help but wonder if there isn't a difference in kind too, just, and this may be overly simplistic, but a difference in kind too in just the nature of Islam as opposed to Judaism in terms of their militancy towards Christianity.
Right. I think that is true. Islam is a religion of world conquest. They want to dominate and run everything. And the Jews are a leave us alone religion, right?
Right.
And they the Jews know how to come to different countries and get involved in the economy, and they do well. And this actually brings up another issue that I'd like to bring up, because one of the things that the anti-Semites do is they will point to nefarious Jews, all right, George Soros types who are doing destructive things. Or I mentioned the Frankfurt School earlier. There were a number of Jews involved in that. Or if you look at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, there were a whole bunch of Jews involved in that. And the arts and entertainment world, the Hollywood has been a cesspool of corruption that has contaminated our public life, and a lot of Jews are major players in Hollywood. Right? So anti-Semites say, see, bad guy.
Yeah.
And the answer to that, and I've seen a lot of people change the subject when I bring this up, when I present this argument, but I've not seen anybody attempt to answer it. The Jews, for various reasons, historical, cultural, whatever, the Jews are a high-performance people, okay? A high-performance people. And they excel. They're just, if you look at they're less than 1% of the world's population. And if you look at the percentage of Nobel Prizes and patents and inventions and contributions, they have a completely outsized contribution. Right. And that remains the case even when they go into the mafia. So when a kid grows up in a Jewish home, and mom and dad say you're going to be a doctor, banker, or lawyer, or you're going to be a scholar and you're going to excel, that's what you're going to do. It's a high performance, high demand culture, and when they go into physics or go into whatever discipline they go into, and they excel and they rise to the top, that's they get a Nobel Prize. But some of them go into a life of revolution or a life of crime or a life of and they also are competent, right? So the good that they do is outsized. The damage that they do is outsized. And the illustration that I use, and it's a wonderful illustration. One of my favorite movies is Chariots of Fire. And you have parallel stories of Eric Liddell, the Christian runner, and Harold Abrams. I think it's Abrams. Anyway,
I can't remember if it's Abraham or Abrams.
Abrahams or we'll call him Harold. But they're both fast. They're both Olympians. They're both very, very good at what they do. But Eric Liddell is a Christian, and he says, when I run, I feel his pleasure.
Yeah.
He's running by grace. He runs really fast, but he's running by grace. And Harold is driven. He's just obsessed, driven. And he runs really fast too. But Eric Liddell is happy and, under God's pleasure. And that's a good example, I think, of what Christians ought to be. Christians, and this is the Pauline strategy, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. In Romans 11, Paul says everything is about striving and jealousy and enmity between Jew and Gentile. And Paul's strategy is for the Gentiles to live in such a way as to provoke the Jews to jealousy. Right? Anti-Semitism is about the most anti-Pauline mentality that you can you can develop, because it's being jealous of the Jews instead of living in such a way as to have them be jealous of you.
Right.
So what I want to see Christians do is cultivate a distinctively Christian culture so that we live under the Deuteronomic blessings of God. And Paul knew that kind of thing would get the Jews' attention, because they're competitive, they're strivers. And in my book, American Milk and Honey, I developed this idea at length, where I believe that God wants us to live under His pleasure by grace, so that it will provoke the Jews to jealousy, so that they will come back to Christ, so that the great blessing, life from the dead that Paul promises will happen.
We'll get back to the show in just a moment, but today's show is sponsored by our friends over at Citizens Granary. For prices as low as $2 a bag, they can ship or hand deliver organic, ground, or whole grains right to your door. If you want to make your family healthy again, the way to do that is to eat fresh milled bread, pancakes, waffles, and pastries, and we know you're going to do it anyway, but you got to do it the way God intended. So it's time to give up that stale, dead bread on the shelves of Walmart and eat real food. I used to think that stubbornness and good causes is enough to keep me going, but my family and I have been using Citizens Granary, and it provides the needed fuel to do the hard work of building a Christian conservative media company from the ground up, and it can help you too. So you need to go to citizensgranary.com to support this business that cares about the things that you care about. And when you check out, make sure to use the code IndieThinker for 15% off your next order, and to let them know that we sent you.
One of my thoughts, and I don't know if I'm right about this, but just a quandary I have with the whole, specifically like the Jews in Hollywood kind of trope idea, is that it's particularly unchristian in that I think underneath that is the kind of G.K. Chestertonian idea that when you remove something, it will be replaced, that void is not going to remain empty, that when people stop believing in God, it doesn't mean they believe in nothing, it means they'll believe in anything. And when you remove God from the culture, that also means you're going to have to replace the devil. So that means that you'll make anybody that you don't like the devil. So what I think really disturbs me is when we see this in Christian circles or non, because I think it's happening in both ways, is that what this actually is a manifestation of anti-Semitism or a kind of emotional reaction toward the Jews is actually a really post-Christian phenomenon.
Yes. And this is why the explosion of anti-Semitism that we're dealing with happened on the left. Right. So
exactly. Wokeism in the first place is a response to, it's the post-Christian answer.
Right. It's the post-Christian answer. Basically, what you have to have a devil. In the post-war consensus, in the respectable, liberal, progressive mentality, John Foster Dulles, and after World War II, the role of the devil was supplied by Hitler. Okay, Hitler was that we don't, and we're going to judge. We're going to hold the Nuremberg trials, and we're still righteous. We're righteous and godly because we're judging the devil.
Right.
We're condemning the devil because men need to feel righteous. When they reject God and banish God, they have no standard for righteousness. But if they keep the devil, then righteousness is the opposite of whatever that is, right? So the post-war consensus for a number of decades considered Hitler to be it. Hitler was the devil. Hitler was the devil. But we got tired of that, and the left moved on, and they have made their new devil the Jews, right? But it's just scapegoating, and you're not going to really get a true realignment, a true readjustment until we return to God. We need to confess Him.
I wonder if this doesn't also have to do with hermeneutics. Because as some people take a superficial glance at the scripture, they'll look at the Pharisees and the Sadducees and see that they were enemies of Jesus, and maybe even go over to Acts chapter 2 and see that Peter has no problem accusing Jewish people of the blood of Christ on their hands. But I'm curious what you would say about this, but I'll go ahead and share my thought on this is that it is not particular to the Jews, that this is more about human nature than it is about the Jews specifically.
Yeah. Who killed Jesus? If you look at Acts chapter 4, who killed Jesus? Well, Herod, Pontius Pilate, all the Jews.
Yeah.
The Romans crucified him.
Yeah.
The Jews pressured Pilate to crucify him. Basically, the disciples ran away. So we're all entailed in this. And anybody who can look at the crucifixion of Christ, Dostoevsky has a great insight in his description of the Grand Inquisitor. When Christ is brought up before the Grand Inquisitor, a Catholic, a Catholic who's very much in the position of Caiaphas, right? It's all the same mentality. It's the same God hatred that unbelieving Jews have and unbelieving Gentiles have. They don't love God.
The other concern that I have about this from like a post-Christian perspective too is when we talk about, or I won't say we, but when people talk about White Boy Summer, or when they revise American history to praise white European Christendom and emphasis on the white and the European, my concern is that isn't the ultimate goal for the Christian. The ultimate goal for the Christian is sinners become saints by grace through faith in Christ. And while we fight the culture war because we want the culture to reflect the glory of God and the virtue and the character of God, that isn't the ultimate goal. So I feel like the Great Commission is lost in the midst of trying to revise history and trying to take these racial essentialistic arguments. Now, I know what people would say to that. They would say, well, when we talk about White Boy Summer, we're talking about Christian virtues within White Boy Summer. And my response to that is, okay, but why does it have to be White Boy Summer?
Right.
Why can't it be the summer that we're really after, which is a Christian summer?
So here's and this is an area where we might differ some. When they say white European, it's not racial. There's one race, human race. It's not primarily ethnicity or tribal identity. It's culture. Okay? The thing that's valuable about European culture is that it's century after century after century of weaving the Bible into our legal system, for example.
Right.
Right. So
yeah, we don't disagree there. No, totally.
Right. So, but what these guys are doing is they're latching on to they want to preach like Billy Graham, and so they buy a floppy Bible like his, or they copy the wrong thing. They latch onto the wrong thing. The thing that made Europe great was not the skin color, because when the gospel came to Europe, I'm of Scottish descent, and the Scots were the last civilized white people, right? Maybe the Frisians were. Anyway, maybe the Frisians were behind us. But it's easy for the guy in the grip of a racialist dogma to look at savages in the Amazon or in Africa and sneer at them. They're cooking their food over dung, and they're doing all this stuff. But just not that many centuries ago, my ancestors were painting themselves blue and running naked into battle. Come on, what made the difference? It was not. It wasn't that all these white yahoos suddenly had their white genetics kick in, and they started building cathedrals. It was
It's
not that at
Christianity.
all. It was the Christian faith that came. And so consequently, when the Christian gospel comes to China or comes to Africa or comes to any part of the world, when that gospel has been working and functioning in that society for 3 centuries, there will be cultural glories. And the cultural glories of Africa and South America and North America will be distinct from one another. And we're all going to appreciate it because we're not in a competition.
I think it's important to make this distinction as well, because when we talk about woke reactionary right, or we talk about woke left, we're also not fighting for the holy middle. Based upon what you just said with Christendom and European Christendom, I totally get that historical argument, right? So European in the sense that there's common law, there's practices, there's legislation going in through decades, through centuries that have brought us into the present that made America possible in such a way that we can't even break it apart. We can't separate those things and understand what European culture is outside of Christianity and its impact in America.
There's a story that's told, don't have a footnote ready, but Supreme Court Justice Scalia, who's obviously Italian in descent, took a trip back to Italy to reconnect with his roots and didn't. And on his way back home, he stopped in England and realized, I'm an Anglo-Saxon, right? I'm not genetically Anglo-Saxon. I'm a Scalia. But the legal tradition that I live in is
That's a great point.
Is a Protestant he was a Catholic, but the legal tradition he was in was Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And that's why culture matters, and the gospel shapes culture. And one of the things that the mistakes that these gents are making is they are fomenting discord, which is going to be destructive of the growth of Christian culture rather than advancing it.
Do you believe it's something that pastors should address from the pulpit?
Yes. They have to be very careful in how they do it. But yes, I do believe that the church is essentially political, not partisan, not vote for Murphy kind of. I don't think a Christian sanctuary should have an American flag in it. I don't think we ought to have candidates for office giving their pitch from the pulpit. I don't think we should be nonpartisan in that respect. But the simple presence of a large group of people in a town worshiping God the Father, it has political ramifications
100%,
of necessity.
Right. Yeah, I've always classified that whole conversation like, should Christians be political? I've always said, well, let's just change what we mean by political, or change that word and replace it with moral. And there's no Christian on the planet that would argue that Christians shouldn't be moral.
Right.
Well, then when we realize that political conversations are largely moral conversations, then we realize, yes, Christians should be political.
Right. And we think people complain that Christians get out of their lane when they speak about politics. And I say, no, you're chopping babies up into pieces.
Yeah.
You got out of your lane.
Yeah.
You started trying to legislate immorality.
Right.
Right. And we're protesting that. You're not in charge of who is a human being or not.
If you say we should talk about this from the pulpit, the one thing that I have a concern about in the back of my mind is the divisive nature of this, especially if it's not widespread. But potentially gangrenous. So what I mean by that is the best kind of historical analogy I can think of is that right as Constantine had taken over, you've got this huge schism in the church going on right now between the Donatists and the Caecilians. And they're arguing about those who apostatized or gave over their Bible, gave over their scriptures during persecution time. And the Donatists have kind of a, you might call a more hard-nosed approach, and they say the Caecilians, even if they're pastors, they've got to get rebaptized and they got to get recatechized because they apostatized. So Constantine comes in and kind of solves this debate by taking the side of the Caecilians and says that no, these guys can continue to maintain their role as priests and all this kind of stuff. All that to say is that ultimately, that I think that that's an anecdote for sometimes what Christians do get in the habit of, which is cutting off their nose to spite their face, and sometimes becoming their own worst enemy. So I'm curious about whether or not you think that this is a serious enough issue to create the kind of division that may come when we discuss this issue, being so kind of isolated to certain specific places online.
Yeah, so I don't think the pulpit should be dedicated to an attack on Jones, Smith, and Murphy.
Okay.
Right? But just to illustrate, I'm currently preaching through the book of Acts. Okay? Expository sermons through the book of Acts. In chapter 1 is the Lord Jesus gives us sort of a table of contents for the book. The gospel is going to be preached in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. And then the book of Acts just tracks with that. Mm-hmm. Right. So the gospel, all the initial action happens in Jerusalem. And then Stephen comes to the fore in Acts 6. He's murdered at the end of Acts 7. And then after the murder, a persecution breaks out. And all the disciples fan out into Judea and Samaria, points 2 and 3 in Acts 1. And then Philip goes up to Samaria and preaches the gospel there. And then he goes and preaches the gospel to the Ethiopian eunuch, who is from a faraway country. And then the rest of the book of Acts is preaching the gospel. And then Cornelius, the Roman centurion in Acts 10. So you have the whole structure of the book has to do with how God is making one new man out of the two, as Paul says in Ephesians. So there's a new identity, Christian, and that doesn't erase my identity as an American, as a male, as someone of Scottish descent, but to refer to Augustine's structure, it's the ordo amoris. I have to know how to order my loves. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Jesus says, if you love father, mother, wife, children more than me, you can't be my disciple. And then Paul says, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So the Bible says, don't love your wife, love your wife. Mm-hmm. Well, the only way to resolve that in a non-contradictory way is to develop an understanding of how my loves are to be structured. So it's like if you're playing softball and you think I'm playing shortstop, and if it comes to me, I go to second. Mm-hmm. If this happens, I go here. If this happens, I go here. So in the Bible, you find, what's her name? Rahab betrayed her homeland by faith. Mm-hmm. She hid the spies by faith. And she was a traitor by faith. David pretended to be mad by faith. Jeremiah insisted that the Jews surrender to the Babylonians by faith. In Hebrews 11, it says, by faith they stopped the mouths of lions, conquered kingdoms, were sawn into, so there are some great victories, and there are also some martyrdoms. Mm-hmm. And faith knows how to look at those situations and say, okay, faithfulness in this moment requires that that I defy my king, right? So if I can easily see myself hiding a Chinese Christian from my government, right? Because they were distributing Bibles somewhere they weren't allowed to distribute Bibles. So at the same time, I also see myself obeying my government when they are making lawful decisions and so on. So I have to know how much do I love the Word of God? How much do I love Jesus? How much do I love my fellow Christian of another nationality? How much do I love a fellow American? One of my barbers is a worshiper of Thor. All right. Right. So, let's say I'm chatting at church with someone from Zambia who is a Christian and conservative, reformed, same statement of faith with me. And then my fellow American who is a Thor worshiper, well, I need ordo amoris. I need to know how to structure my allegiances.
Yeah, that's great, because I sometimes struggle, to be honest, parsing the nature of this thing in this way, that right now we're experiencing, at least conservatism, the right is experiencing a kind of cultural revival with Trump being in office, undoubtedly pushing aside the progressive Christians to the side. He's doing so many good things from a Christian perspective that I wonder about the strategic nature of going after people who otherwise might be on our same side, and whether or not that is the most wise strategic thing to do. So I do struggle parsing that sometime, but I think that what you just gave is a little bit of the answer.
Yeah, you have to pick your battles carefully, and of course we're not infallible, and sometimes we're going to make the mistake when we call out something, but we should review the game film, learn from our mistakes, and yeah.
I want to be clear, too, that when we're talking about right and left, that all of these titles can be a little bit flawed in everything that we've done. But you are also not defending some vestige of the holy middle. I think Megan Basham the other day posted about Rick Warren and said that Jesus was in the middle, and he had a thief on the right and a thief on the left, but Jesus is in the middle, which is just very similar to the bumper sticker. I worship the lamb, not the donkey or the elephant, which is so ridiculous to me. It's not that we're worshiping political parties, but we're being honest about moral issues as they arise on either side of these things. But you're not trying to intentionally, or not trying to communicate a holy middle position through all of this.
Yeah, no. I share your concern about left and right wing, because that's a secular metric that is in some ways entirely inaccurate. So, for example, the Nazis are popularly thought to be extreme right wing.
Yeah, I've totally thought
that. But
they're
National Socialists.
Yeah, right? Yes, exactly.
They're social. They're a variant of the left wing. Right. So the metric itself is flawed, and it comes from the seating in the French legislature after the French Revolution. The moderate revolutionaries sat on the right side of the chamber, and the fire eaters sat on the left side of the chamber. But they were all revolutionaries, right? So right wing, left wing is a revolutionary category. And I can use it in a rough and ready way. Yeah, red-pilled, okay. Right wing, okay. Conservative, okay. But fundamentally, my identity is a Bible Christian. I want to be a Bible Christian. And I don't think that fits on the spectrum as nicely and neatly as some people want it to. So I object to the metric, and then would point out that Rick Warren's simplistic portrayal of Jesus as being the moderate, because he was in the middle. Well, he was a crucified moderate, and that's something that moderates don't generally.
Yeah, that's typically reserved for the radicals.
Yes.
So how do we maintain our radical cutting edge as Christians in the culture, while also not falling for the trap of merely trying to weigh into controversy for the sake of clickbait?
Right. So if you are always joining in with a food fight that somebody else started, something erupts, and then the Christians show up to say, here, can we participate in this? Can we throw a biscuit? One of the things my dad taught me is, he said, always act, never react. And so I think Christian preachers ought to be intent on building the kingdom where they are, growing the church where they are, planting Christian schools where they are. I think we have a respite with Trump. Trump is not a Christian worldview thinker, but he's doing a lot of good things. And we have 2 years, maybe more, 2 years until the midterms. So we have a minimum, I think, of 2 years to really set ourselves to kingdom work, which is preaching the gospel, basically birth and growth, evangelism, preaching the gospel, growing the church.
I want to interject just to say this, because I think this is an answer to my question about when is division okay? Because I asked you the question of whether or not bringing this subject up is divisive, and I actually think that what a good retort to that is potentially, well, how is what people are doing in the woke reactionary right not divisive? So we need to stop that in order so that we can produce unity.
That's correct. So the Bible tells us to reject a divisive man. And someone who wanted to be cute could say, "Isn't that divisive? Rejecting?"
Yes. Yeah.
No. If you remove a cantankerous person, you're taking the quarrelsome person out of the room, reduces the quarrels, right? And I think that it is the job of a pastor to get the right people out of the church. You know, if someone is cantankerous, divisive, belligerent, and they just won't be at peace, then there needs to be a way of moving them along. It may be church discipline, it may be less formal than that, but there's certain people that we're supposed to divide from. There are other people that we're supposed to, Ephesians 4, labor to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. It's hard work maintaining unity. Right. So I want to maintain unity with certain kind of people, and I want to make sure that I diverge from a certain kind of person.
Yeah, the reason that's so important is I think that you are totally right about the time frame here. If there's anything that I came into January really passionate about, really certain of, and certain of very little, is that the next 2 years to 4 years are going to be very, very important for Christians to try to reestablish, to rebuild the culture that's been torn down. Certainly over the last 8 years, but I think that's too simplistic. I think it's been much longer than that. And we've got a lot of work to do, and we cannot be slowed down by silly things that shouldn't preoccupy our time.
Amen.
All right. Well, Pastor Doug, thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate you having the conversation with me.
Happy to do it. Thank you.
Our thanks again to our guests for being on the show today. Indie Thinker with Reed Uberman was brought to you by our sponsors. If you like what you heard today, please do us a big favor and give it a 5-star review and like it and share it with friends. And if you want to hear more awesome guests, make sure to check out past episodes. Indie Thinker is a nonprofit paid for by our sponsors and the generous gifts of people like you. In order to hear more great guests like you did today, please consider giving a tax-deductible gift by going to indiethinker.org. And just remember, your voice matters, but infinitely more when you think for yourself.